so it doesn't get too dark. Okay, so last week we looked at the book of 2 Samuel, where we saw pretty much the godly height of the kingdom under David. In many ways, the greatest, most godly king after the Lord's own heart. And all of his contrast with Saul's failures before him. And then you have to keep that in mind as we then move forward into history and we see how things slide even further and further downhill from David's great example. But before we get to the events of 1 Kings, background history. Author is unfortunately unnamed. If in terms of people who might be the author, the best guess is Jeremiah, the prophet who was most active going up to the end of Jerusalem and the early time in the exile. However, the last section seems to be written from a Babylonian exile's perspective rather than an Egyptian exile's perspective, which is where Jeremiah was hauled off to after Jerusalem was finally broken and the people decided very foolishly to rebel against the governor that was put in place. So, giving it the benefit of the doubt, it is very possible that Jeremiah wrote the basic gist of everything up to the last part, and then he just added in the last part from a letter that was sent from one of the other Babylonian exiles to him in Egypt, but can't be certain. It's entirely possible that it's one of the other Babylonian prophets in exile, but most traditions say Jeremiah. The time of writing we can be relatively more certain of. Judging by the time of the events, we know that at the very earliest, it was written after the fall of Jerusalem in 586. A little after that, because of the final appendix in 2 Kings, but it was written before the return. So that is a definite end date of 516. 516. I'm blanking on the date of the Edict of Cyrus. I want to say 313, but that's the Edict of Milan. It's going to come to me in 10 minutes, and I'm not going to remember why. So, intended audience. This is very much written in mind as an intended continuation of 1 and 2 Samuel, to the point where years later, when the Greek translation was made, 1 and 2 Samuel and 1 and 2 Kings, which were the Scroll of Samuel in one and the Scroll of Kings in one, were divided into 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th kingdoms, because they are very much one continuous history. But the point of it all is to look back and see, how did these kings fare in terms of Father David? And for most of them, not great. A lot of the times it is very much condemned for the idolatry, especially of the northern kingdoms, but also sometimes the kings of the southern kingdom as well, of Judah. And even when the kings don't outright engage in idolatry, oftentimes they don't do very much to stem its practice in Israel, which gets into the issue of the high places, where there are places where people sacrifice to idols outside of the temple of God, as opposed to the temple of God. Not that they were outside the temple, that was an entirely different thing which people were very much condemned for later. But themes and literary features, one thing that very much sets the Book of Kings apart is its use of other sources. It is very clear that this is not a full history. Multiple times the writer says, if you want to know more about this king, go read the royal minutes, so to speak. The annals of the kings of Judah, or the annals of the kings of Israel, or look at these works, and there is hypothesized that there was a record kept in the temple of the acts of Elijah and Elisha as well. But it is very clear that he's not writing this as someone who lived through all of it, because this is one of the books that takes up the most amount of time in history. Probably second only to Genesis, in terms of how many lifetimes it covers.
When you say that, you're talking about First and Second Kings.
Yes, not specifically First King. When it was written in Hebrew, it was a big scroll, one big scroll. But then when it was converted into Greek, they said, yeah, big scrolls are expensive. Why don't we divide this into two regular-sized scrolls? And that way it'll be easier to make and carry around and produce. And that's also when it was grouped into the third and fourth kingdoms, along with 1st and 2nd Samuel, because it is very much one long history of Israel, but looking at the styles, you can tell that they were written by different authors, just because of the amount of focus that is put onto the first two kings in 1st and 2nd Samuel. Then when you get to 1st Kings, the amount of focus paid to Solomon, arguably the height of the United Kingdom. He gets a couple chapters, then they're moving on in one king after another, bam, 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 bam. So it is a much more overview style rather than an in-depth, full examination, which we had in 1st and 2nd Samuel. A common refrain is the praise or condemnation in kind of stock phrases. The kings of Israel, the northern kingdom that broke away, are often condemned for continuing in the sin of Jeroboam, which is making the golden calves at Bethel and Dan and practicing idolatry like that. And that oftentimes it gets added on top of by not just those idols, but also encouraging the people to worship the Canaanite gods and other foreign gods that get imported from national alliances. One of the other refrains is continuing in the sin of Ahab, which is how he got passed down to us as the most wicked of all kings. And on the southern side, if a king is kind of good, he's praised as he worshipped the Lord, but he did not tear down the altars at the high places. Until we get to Hezekiah, where He is praised for doing that, but on the other hand, he is condemned for using the treasures of the temple to try to save the kingdom, as well as his own pride in showing all of his possessions in an attempt to woo the Babylonian emissaries to helping them against Assyria, which would come back to bite them at the end of 2 Kings. But that's in the future. We're talking about the themes which carry over in both of them. And one other theme that especially comes out is the rise of the independent prophet. We kind of saw in Exodus, you had Moses, who was the prophet leader of the people. And he led them, and then Joshua was their leader and a prophet as well. But then after that, they had judges, which are also leaders, before eventually that culminated with Samuel, who led the people, and then the leadership was passed from the prophet to the king. And Saul was supposed to be the spiritual leader of the people. He wasn't a priest, but he set the example for them. Which then, once he kind of failed at that, but once David rose to the throne, there were still prophets. There was Nathan, who worked closely with him, but very much David was still the moral and religious exemplar of the people. But now we see that stereotype of the leader, of the king being the religious leader as well as the political leader, kind of waning as the kings dive into outright idolatry, and prophets like Elijah and Elisha have to rise up and try to call the people back against the wishes and even the rulings of the king. Any other thoughts, comments, or questions on that? Then we'll look at the outline. We first begin with a more in-depth look at a king, the height of the United Kingdom, King Solomon. And it starts out very much where 2 Samuel left off, with David kind of on his deathbed and giving his last words, but there is some additional tension, because David's family drama just never ends. So, if anyone is a fan of fantasy, they're generally familiar with the trope that the oldest son is the heir apparent. He is the crown prince. And unless he dies or somehow gets disinherited, everyone expects that he's going to be the one to rule next. That's not what happened. Solomon was very much not David's oldest son, not even the oldest living one. David had at least 16 older children, and probably even more with other wives and concubines. And depending on how you read the account of Chronicles, he may very well be one of the youngest. But David loved him, and partially because of his religious fervor, he set up Solomon as king rather than his older brother Abijah. Even though Abijah, since he was the oldest, had already went out and secured himself some good backing, and he was already celebrating his soon-to-be coronation, once the news came out that David had crowned Solomon as king. That was kind of embarrassing. And so all of the people who were supporting Abijah suddenly fled. Abijah said, I'm sorry, my fault. But and I'm sorry, but why don't you just let me marry one of the royal concubines and we'll call it even? Which was actually a power play because if you were saying that you were equal to the previous king, marrying one of his wives, obviously that would strengthen his claim to the throne. And so Solomon started his rule by carrying out and putting to death Thurkan. He killed off Joab for all of his multiple crimes in the service of his father David, as well as other people who, even though they supported David, were allowed under David's oath to stay on with him. But Solomon cleaned house.
How old was he? Do we know? He could be a lot,
I'm going to have to double check that so I'm getting it exactly right.
I didn't know maybe he thought he was.
Yeah, it mentions it, but I'm blanking on the exact age.
Okay.
Gonna have to look at that. We'll come back to that if we have time later.
Yes, he found Solomon. Yeah.
Yes.
But he was crowned king.
I'd have to look into Chronicles for that. Because it generally, or it might be in chapter 11, as it gives a recounting of his rule.
I have a note in the commentary. It says, how do you say his name?
Abijah?
The fourth son of David. Who was? Say it. Was
Adonijah. Yeah. Adonijah.
There's no, was at the time 35 years old. He is likely the oldest surviving son of David. He's 35 and he's the oldest. So Solomon was less, according to that law, Solomon was less than 35. And people didn't live that old.
No.
Unless you're the king.
Yeah. I mean, the average lifespan is, when we look back and we see average lifespans in the 40s, that's not because people died at 40. That's because so many infants died in childbirth, which really cuts down on the life expectancy when you have a lot of zeros in there. Most of the time. In the Psalms, we see that David says, our lives are but 70 years, 80 if we have the strength. So it's, if someone gets up to, people get old at roughly the same age. 20 years was not middle-aged. They aren't getting up to the 90s and 100s as often as we are today, but they're not dying in their 40s either.
So what would you say that lifespan, 70? Back then?
I'd say for the average male, late 70s.
Okay.
There is, of course, there's a difference between mean and median and mode. If you look at the modal page, It may not be that old either.
Right, 45, 50.
Meaning, yeah, that would, child infancy birth would affect the age at which most people die.
Mm-hmm.
Here we are. Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel 40 years. Doesn't say at what age he was. But considering
40 years, he was probably mid to late 20s. Not terribly old, but not terribly young either.
Yeah. And I was thinking he's really young.
But back to the outline. After Solomon finally firmly established the kingdom in his hands, the first thing he did was make a sacrifice to the Lord. And in the famous story where Solomon is offered pretty much a blank check from God, and what he asks for is not defeat of his enemies, but for wisdom. And God grants it to him. And we get in chapter 4 the famous story of the two women and the infant, where this woman truly cares for the child, therefore she is the mother. As well as other instances of restructuring things for better, wise administration. But then we kind of hit the height of Solomon's grandeur. What he's most remembered for is fulfilling all the work that David put in and actually building the temple. It was, at the time, probably a marvel of engineering, where it was set up so that no stone or tool was made at the actual temple grounds. Everything was prepared at the quarry and made to fit stone on stone with minimal lime, embossed with gold. It was one of, in modern times, it would be, considering it's about the size of a football stadium, so I think roughly the size of a stadium, the size of a field, probably about the size of this sanctuary, but considering the actual number of people who went in, it was perfect. It was very grand for its necessary use. Because, as with the tabernacle, the common people did not go into the main sanctuary. That was for the priests and the Levites to take care of. In many ways, it was an engranduring, if that's a word, a making more grand of the tabernacle. The same basic construction with a few additional side rooms added on for just added utility. The basic design is still the same, with the holy place for where only the priests enter, and then the most holy place with the ark where only the high priest enters once a year, and it is still divided by the curtain. Same basic proportions, with the extra width added 4 rooms added onto the holy place, and an amazing amount of gold decorations of angels, and then whole new supersized worship implements, such as the sea, the great sea made for all the ceremonial hand washing that people had to do, which was about the size of I think, 4 bathtubs, if I'm remembering correctly, wide, and in a bowl shape, which for the time was an amazing amount of work put into gold just for that kind of worship. And then, after the temple's finally been built and all the grandeur is there, Solomon shows up himself and dedicates it in person. He prays, thanking God, and prays that all people are able to come and have access to God in that holy place. And the Lord shows his approval by that old sign of the cloud, which guided Israel in the exile, and now shows his presence by filling the entire temple with a cloud so dense that the priests couldn't actually do their work the first day that the temple was dedicated. But, that took 7 years. It was great and grand, but a king of Solomon's wealth deserves a city and a palace equally great and grand. And so even though David had a palace of cedar, Solomon one-upped him and spent almost twice as long building his own new personal palace, paneled with gold and ivory and pretty much every precious gem. The amount of wealth that flowed in comparatively was about the size of multiple small, considering the size of Israel, far outstripped what even larger nations were doing. He was standing basically toe-to-toe in terms of wealth production with titans like Egypt or Assyria. It was one phrase that always impressed me is that gold was as precious then as silver was in other times, and silver was so abundant that it was basically things that you would toss to children. Perhaps poetic exaggeration, but it was an amazing time of prosperity for the king and for the kingdom. And this is where we also see the Queen of Sheba, who, upon hearing of Solomon's wisdom, comes to visit him and was so impressed that she praised him and brought him gifts. But not everything was good. Solomon's broadly known wisdom also attracted multiple offers of marriage from the other kingdoms who recognized his prosperity and wanted to say, "No, don't attack us, and to prove that you're not going to attack us, marry one of my daughters." That was the custom of the time, and he played ball, even though kings weren't supposed to do that, according to Deuteronomy, but it was what kings did at the time, so Solomon played ball, and it ended up that he dropped the ball by caving into his wives' desires and building shrines and offering sacrifices to their gods as well.
How many different countries were around there? Because I read he had like 700 wives or something. There weren't that many countries around. He must have married other women.
Yes, the more wives you have, the more status you have.
Oh, so that was another reason.
Yes.
In chapter 11 it says he had 700 wives
Yeah.
and a royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray.
Just thinking about how with 70 people in it.
Just think of the drama.
Yeah. Yeah.
We'll talk about that when we get into Proverbs. But today, when we think of nations, we think of huge groupings of people. We live in one of the in terms of area, one of the larger countries. But, like, even when you go to Europe, the land area of France is so much smaller than America. And then you get into the Baltic area, and you try learning all the nations on that map there, and it's just, there's so many small ones, and they keep fracturing because it's, in many ways, a lot of modern nations are basically empires. While back then, without easy travel, a lot of kingdoms were pretty much big families. They weren't huge empires, and just in the land that we think of as modern-day Israel, there was Israel itself. Moab was, well, Israel and Palestine, I should say. Israel, Palestine, Jordan, that kind of area. There was Israel, Philistia, Moab, Edom, Aram, not to mention a lot of the subgroups of the bigger ones that rise.
Yeah.
And when a king's that powerful, he can play ball and say, okay, you're really going to just give me your one daughter, your third born? Really? This is all the great king of Egypt can offer for such a wealthy partnership? I think you can do better. Because, again, at the time, David had 16 sons ahead of Solomon. That's not even counting how many daughters. If we think that's equal, Pharaoh arguably would probably have even more than 16 that he could say, yeah, I can load off 5 daughters onto you, why not? Not wise, but politically made him look powerful. And for as wise as he was, he did not always put that into practice. Which then leads into the division of the kingdom. Solomon had built up Israel a whole lot, but all that money and all that labor had to come from somewhere. And taxes, we think of nowadays as taxes are money. Taxes back then were primarily labor. And sometime, and if it wasn't a particularly busy farming time, in Solomon's day you would sometimes spend up to 3, 4, 5, 6 months away from home working for the king. And when his son was about to be crowned, the people came to him and said, okay, yeah, it's really great that this is all built up, but I think we're good for a while. Can you lighten the load a little bit? Maybe not have us be away from our families for half a year? And like the immature little punk that Rehoboam was, who hadn't learned his father's wisdom, he first went to his advisors that were passed down from his father, who told him, oh yeah, do this. Because of how much your father has done, if you just ask for an equal amount as what most other kings ask for, they're gonna love you. It's an easy sell. But that didn't sound quite appealing to him, so he asked his friends, and they said, oh no, if you give in to them, you're gonna look like a pansy, man. No, you gotta crack the whip, double down. And because he was an immature little punk, he went with his friends, And the people called his bluff and said, yeah, no, we're out of here. And they gathered around Jeroboam, which is very confusing, but Jeroboam was a popular leader of the laborers who had fled from a failed insurrection during the time of Solomon, and when he heard that Solomon was dead, he came back, and when Rehoboam decided to double down and not play pop and not play ball with the people, they said, you know what, we'll take you, Jeroboam, we'll take you up on that now. You be our king. And then the kingdoms were thereafter divided. But it's at this point that we realize that neither of them was particularly a good king, because Jeroboam, for all his popularity with the people, was not particularly on the side of God. Back then, religion and politics had a very fine division, and because he didn't want his people religiously, and therefore politically, tied to Judah and the temple, he said, all right, I gotta set up my own way of worship, and I'll do it better with blackjack and hookers. Scratch the blackjack, but double the hookers. And so he built the 2 golden calves at Bethel in the south, where most people would basically be passing through if they were going to be heading to Jerusalem, and then up north at Dan, where he adopted the sort of imagery as Aaron did in the wilderness wandering of the golden calf, which was supposed to be God's mount, but God had said, no image, do not bow down to any of them, and as much as he might try to pretend that he was still following the Lord, he led the people into idolatry. And therefore, God said, nope, you are not keeping that dynasty. And he even sent a prophet from Judah to come up and prophesy against them, that they would be destroyed. But that story unfortunately ended sadly, because God had told the prophet to not stop and eat with anyone, but a kind, godly man decided that he really wanted to show hospitality to God's servant, and pressured him, and because the godly man told him that God told him to host him, rather than trusting what God said, he trusted what the guy said, and God followed through, and the man perished. And that godly man very much mourned.
I do have a question.
Yes.
When Jeroboam was setting up all those places of worship, was there underlying reason so that people would go back to worship at the temple? Was that one of the reasons he did that?
Yes. If, again, the church, and in America we a lot think of church and state as separate. But back then, church and state were very much united. If the people were going down to worship in Jerusalem, not only is that a lot of money going to his adversary, that's a lot of his people's attention going there as well. And since the Jerusalem temple still supported the Davidic dynasty, they would be hearing a lot of, he would probably consider it Davidic propaganda, which would make the people think, okay, maybe once Rehoboam is off the throne, maybe the next king will be better and we can go for him. But he's not going to give them that opportunity. He's going to try to cut them off at the pass and say, no, you don't have to go all the way there to that mean king's territory. Just stay in Israel and worship these convenient idols. But then after that, we get a quick fly-through of history for a chapter and a half, 2.5 chapters, of just this king of Israel, this king of Judah, this king of Israel, this king of Judah, this king of Israel, this king of Judah, until eventually we get to Ahab, but more importantly, Elijah. We get introduced to him in some pretty spectacular fashion when Elijah marches up to Ahab and says, "Yo, Gog, your idolatry is not cool with the Lord, therefore it's not going to rain until the Lord says it will. Have fun with that. Bye." And he peaced out of Israel for a while because Ahab and his Phoenician queen Jezebel were very heavily pushing Baal worship and killing anyone who worshipped the Lord, because that was treason, because that's what those Davidians worship down in Judah. You're basically saying that this king is an imposter, right? But the Lord provided for Elijah, first by bringing him food that was bread and cheese carried by ravens as he hid in the wilderness by brooks. And then once the brook dried up, he went to the widow of Zarephath, and her food, the little pat of flour and olive oil, did not dry up for years and years that Elijah stayed with her. And Elijah even did an additional miracle by raising her son from the dead. But eventually the time came when God said, "All right, you've been softened up enough. That's it. Elijah, go on this force once and for all. We're going to show who's the real God around here." And that's when we get the showdown on Mount Carmel, where all the prophets of Baal, who was supposedly a storm god with thunder and lightning, who should very easily be able to send down fire from the sky, didn't. But then Elijah, with one simple prayer, had the Lord send down fire and consume the altar that was soaked with water. And so, all that 450 prophets of Baal were killed, but Ahab and Jezebel were not turned from their ways, and so Elijah went and had him threw himself a little pity party.
Who killed those 450 prophets of Baal?
Elijah called for the people of Israel, if you really believe that the Lord is God, put it into practice. Yeah, Elijah did have an amazing gift of running given to him afterwards, but he didn't super speed his way to cut all of them down personally. But after what was seeming a great victory turned into another instance of rejection, Elijah threw himself a pity party and went down into Mount Sinai before eventually he came to Mount Horeb, which was the place where God originally gave the law, where God came to him again, preceded by a great storm, a great fire, a great earthquake. But God was not in any of those great and mighty signs. He came in a gentle whisper. And he assured Elijah, "There's still a remnant for me, but as for you, go and anoint a successor to the king who will take it up, and go anoint your own successor who will carry on your work after you are gone. And then, after that, God continues to work because God shows his power to Ahab in chapter 20, where God gives him victory over his enemies in 3 successive battles. First time, his enemies said, "Oh, we lost because their God was a God of mountains. We should fight on the plains." And then God said, "No, I'm not just a God of mountains. I am the God." And so God gave them victory again. And then they tried fighting in valleys. And God gave them victory again. But Ahab still wasn't having any of it. So he said, "You know, Naboth, that vineyard of yours, that family piece of land that by the law of the Lord cannot leave your family, I want it." Naboth said no, and Jezebel said, "Aha, but you know, if you're dead, you can't object." And so she had him framed for blasphemy and stoned. And then Ahab took the vineyard. And Elijah very much condemned him for that. Micaiah, before eventually, in the next chapter, we see it brought into fruition, where Ahab is killed in the middle of battle. But not before the Lord makes it known who truly is God once again. As we'll see in 2 Kings, this was in the middle of a period of somewhat a truce between the two kingdoms. And the king of Judah was visiting Ahab, and they were about to go to battle together. And all of Ahab's fallen prophets were prophesying, "Oh, go attack, and you will be victorious. Oh, look at these bull horns. Like a bull gores his enemies, you will defeat your enemies." Before the king of Judah said, "Yeah, do you have a prophet of the Lord?" And Ahab said, "Yeah, but I don't like him because he doesn't like me, and he never prophesies anything good about me. But I guess if you really want, we'll bring him in." And Micaiah said, "Yeah, he straight up said, all these prophets have a lying spirit. You're going to die out there. If you actually come back, I am a false prophet." And he was thrown in prison for it until Ahab came back. And Ahab didn't come back because, in what is truly divine coincidence, he decided that I'm going to play it safe and not dress in my royal armor, as he went out on his chariot. And he got wounded, so he tried to fall back. And when someone saw that, oh wait, the person dressed in the king's armor isn't the king, one of them just randomly drew his bow, shot it randomly, and it pierced the king as he was trying to catch his breath. Not exactly a great and glorious victory. And with the end of Ahab, and the Lord shown mighty and true, even when he's rejected, we end the first part of Kings.
Well done.
We have about 7 minutes before it's a full hour. Anything catching anyone's eyes before we...
I have a question.
Yeah.
Ahab is married to Jezebel, right?
Yes.
Okay. Ahab dies, and Jezebel dies, who hasn't been in town yet. Yet Ahab is dead. There's a couple of kings at that time, and why, if Jezebel was the queen, apparently she isn't. And then there's a woman in this whole thing. I don't know how to say the name. Athalia, Athaliah. There's a woman that's the king.
I believe that's the second Kings that's brought up.
Yeah.
But yes,
There's,
What's that?
isn't that his son, or something else?
yeah,
I think she's wicked. She's very wicked woman.
yeah, so first,
She's the mother of what's it? Josiah.
yeah,
Yeah, he was good. All these guys are terrible. Well, and there's some other one, Hezekiah. And some of them are decent. Joash. I mean, there's some of them that are decent, but on the Israel side, they're all terrible. Just one bad dude after another.
it very much is a punishment on the people as well, on the people and the kings for deserting the Lord, to be given what they want to their detriment. Well, they're basically getting one Saul after another.
I think makes this really difficult is that these books are not chronological.
Not strictly chronological. It has a general chronological flow, but it's a lot more thematic. But to go back and why did Jezebel not rule as queen while Ithiel in 2 Kings was able to rule as queen? In Israel, there was not really very many dynasties. Of all of it was more rare than common for the kings of the north to succeed their fathers. And without the great respect of, okay, this queen is from the line of the previous king, when there's not this great dynasty behind her, yeah, that doesn't hold the same kind of weight. And the patriarchy was very strong. While in the south, it was very much the king has to be from David's line. And when the wicked queen rose, she basically killed any possible heir, except for Josiah, who was hidden. And she basically, in a way, she basically held the kingdom hostage, saying, I am the last link to David's line.
We are nothing, right?
Yeah.
And then surprise.
That Jezebel she was in many ways, she was, in modern terms, you might call her a foreign diplomat. She wasn't just a wicked queen, she was a wicked Phoenician princess who was the queen. And a lot of the next godless kings, if I'm remembering correctly, Ahab's son was able to rule for a little bit before Jehu came, and he wasn't going to kill his mama. And any other kings, until Jehu, saw it as more politically advantageous to just continue on with the old than completely overthrow everything and risk the ire of Phoenicia.
These guys tend to eliminate their competition by murder.
Yes.
Like off the house.
Cool. But you know, if there's no one who's a better king than you, it doesn't matter how flimsy your claim is. You get it by default. But I think we'll call it there. We'll close with prayer. Lord, we are called to be your people, yet all too often we stray just like the people of Israel, chasing after what we think is our own best good. Always be with us and guide us to follow what you have given us as the true greatest good, as you have promised us that we will have eternal life in heaven with you. We pray this in Jesus'